Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Please take a moment to click the like button and to subscribe to our YouTube page and to click on the bell icon to be reminded of upcoming episodes.
That's right. So each week, Todd and I will be having a conversation on the lectionary reading from the Gospels for the upcoming weekend. And our goal is to talk about those passages in the context of love, inclusion, and societal justice. Our hope is that our conversation will be centered in justice, as in just talking, but that also something we might say during that time would inspire both of us, along with you, to do more in our Jesus following than just talking. So, Todd, what passage are we looking at this week?
We are the second week of Advent looking at Mark chapter 1, verses 1 through 8.
Man, I love Advent. Can I just say that? I love the
Me too.
season of Advent. Christmas is right around the corner, and Advent marks the new year. There's all kinds of good things. Last week, the theme was hope. What's the theme this week? Do you know? Is it
You're putting me
love,
on the
joy, or
spot.
peace? Is it joy? Is it peace? I think it's peace.
It's probably peace. I think next week, I think the Magnificat is joy.
Okay. Okay. All right. All right.
We're probably
Well,
completely wrong. We'll have to
it's
Google.
all right.
Please don't take our word for it. Google it if you don't know yourself. And if you already know yourself, please don't let this invalidate everything else that we're about to say.
No, this week in my podcast and in my blog entry that I made, I really didn't focus on the Advent theme because I got so engrossed in the actual exegesis of the passage that was for Advent. So I just was so overwhelmed with that, carried away, that I never tied it back into whatever the theme for Advent is supposed to be this second weekend.
Well,
But
that's how I was with my sermon preparation for years. Is I followed the lectionary, but I didn't pay attention to the themes. So
yeah,
that's why it's never just clicked in and been rote memory with those things because it's the same thing. I'm just focused on whatever the passage was.
right, right, right. So what I kind of went down the rabbit hole this week with was this narrative of John the Baptist appearing in the wilderness and what that means, not so much religiously, although there's an implication there, but politically, economically, and socially. What does it mean to work from the edges of your community or in the wilderness areas rather than the center? But the first thing I would like to talk about this week, Todd, is this juxtaposition of Malachi and Isaiah. Only Isaiah is referenced, right? But most people realize that what he's quoting there is the conflation of the passage in Malachi and Isaiah. Isaiah is a liberation passage. It was about being liberated from Babylon and making a plain path for them to return from captivity. And here they
Right.
are, in captivity again to another foreign empire. And the Malachi one that's conflated with this is also interesting to me because it says, then the Lord will suddenly come to his temple. I'm sending a messenger who will prepare the way before me. And the way is to prepare the way for the Lord to come to the temple. Um, the temple was a mess when John the Baptist came on the scene. I mean, the priesthood, the elites, the high priest was chosen by the Roman Empire, the elders, the scribes, the high priest, the priesthood, all of that had become just tools of the Roman Empire to to continue the process of an economy. To quote Walter Brueggemann, it was an economy of extraction, where they were extracting money from those beneath them to enrich and make even more wealthy those above them. And in that process of exploitation and extraction, they were becoming wealthy and powerful and propertied and privileged too. And so here is this passage that Mark, whoever the author of Mark is, this author takes this passage from the Hebrew scriptures about preparing a way for the Lord to come to his temple and cleanse his temple, and a liberation passage of let's prepare the way, synonymous with cleansing the temple state of corruption, would be liberating the people from another foreign oppressor. So yeah, there's a lot there to just chew on.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, again, I appreciate seeing the political ramifications of this, and because it also sets up so well then what John the Baptist is doing. It sets up so well what Jesus is doing. These scriptures are very much setting the tone for what's to follow. And the recognizing the inherent, which I think is overlooked so easily by a lot of Christian leaders, is the full economic, political corruption of Jerusalem, and the temple being at the very center, and the temple itself, intended to be this very holy, sacred place, was an instrument of extraction. It was an instrument of making the rich richer and the poor poorer, and fundamentally working against God's purposes and God's people.
Yeah, most historic Jesus scholars, I bumped into this week too, they believe that John's baptism was actually a form of protest against the temple establishment. And Luke drives this point home further, because in Luke, we find out that John the Baptist's father was part of the priesthood, even if it was, on the edges of the priesthood. He or like remote and had to come in to serve. He was still part of that priesthood. John should have been part of the establishment. He had that Levitical lineage. John should have been a priest, and he turns his back on that. And again, Luke drives this home. He turns his back on working from within the system to change the system, and he becomes a prophet in the Hebrew sense in the wilderness, calling out for repentance and change and preaching salvation if we would change our path. And again, to see that as protest against the temple establishment, and not in religious terms, but in economic and political. Though the last thing I want people to get the impression of is this is some type of Christian versus Judaism, or this religious critique of Judaism. It wasn't that at all. John the Baptist was Jewish. It was Jewish prophets in the wilderness critiquing the Jewish power centers at the center of their society. It was more classist. It was more economic. It was political. It was social. That's what we see happening here. I mean, and even Luke's preaching wasn't religious. It wasn't like,
you mean John?
Sorry, yeah, John, thank you. John the Baptist's preaching wasn't, you need to be stricter in your Sabbath observance, religiously and ritual and temple sacrifice. It was, if you've got 2 cloaks, you need to share one, and you tax collectors, you need to dial it back and only take what's required, and you soldiers, you need to stop exploiting people. This was all about social sins, communal sins, not private piety and individualism. This was about what was happening socially among them, and John was calling that out.
Yeah, and that which is why this is immediately scary to those in power. Because if this was simply a religious reform movement, frankly the powers that be would embrace a religious reform movement as a distraction from what they were doing to the people. That's the reason why everybody was quickly got upset, and why John the Baptist ministry did not last too long before he was imprisoned and ultimately executed was because he was preaching political messages. So
Yeah.
this is, go ahead.
No, Josephus actually confirms exactly what you're saying. And I don't have the quote this week as far as a slide for it, but the reference is in History of the Jews. I think it's chapter 18, paragraph 116 through 119. Anyway, it's in my blog. But he actually says that Herod became alarmed at the crowds that gathered around John, who aroused them to fever pitch with his sermons. Eloquence had such a powerful effect on people that it might lead to sedition, since it seemed that the people were prepared to do everything John recommended. In other words, the reason Herod arrested him and beheaded him was he felt threatened by him. This guy's going to lead a revolution.
Yeah. Yeah. Nobody would be bothered by somebody saying you should go to synagogue more. Nobody was going to be bothered by keep the Sabbath better, nobody was going to be threatened by that type of stuff. This is the type of stuff that John's preaching is anti-Rome, anti-classist messages.
Yeah, he was critiquing the injustices of the system,
Yeah.
and he was getting a following. People were showing up. They were wanting
Because he wasn't preaching an unknown message. Everybody knew it, and he was saying it out loud. The difference was that he was saying it out loud,
right?
And people were saying, "Damn
That's
right,
what we've been waiting to hear."
This is somebody needs to say that, and he's saying it. That's what they're responding to. That's what they're being baptized into. Is they're being baptized into as a form of treachery in a way.
Yeah, and Herod realized it. Herod said, if this continues, this is seditious. Something's going to happen.
Absolutely.
It's threatening.
Yeah.
So if we've got time, I want to share this slide about John's location, the location of his ministry. I think it's cool that, John chose to baptize in living water, what they called living water or running water back then. That was just the phrase for running water. It couldn't be like stagnant. It had to be like moving water for cleansing, for purification. It was a return back to Torah, and specifically Torah economic principles symbolized in the purity ritual of, bathing in living water. But his choice to be in the wilderness, I think, was more than just that's where the Jordan is. I think that's convenient, but his choice to be in the wilderness, I think it has a narrative truth in it too. And so I want to share my screen here. Let me stop talking and try to do that. This is from Ched Myers. Well, there's a lot of authors, but I think Ched is the main one. But the book Say to This Mountain, Mark's Story of Discipleship. And I've given you the reference for pages 11 through 23. You'll notice this is only one paragraph, but the whole section there, 11 through 23, is worth reading on this. And let me move our faces so that I can. Oop, I didn't mean to do that. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Well, let's just do this. I need a tech person, Todd. I think we've said this before.
We're so cutting edge.
I know.
Just on it.
Yeah. Here I am in my little home office. Okay. One of the first steps of hope for people in such wilderness places is to understand that their situation reflects social and political forces, not the divine will. What he's talking about, think of women, think of indigenous populations, think of race, think of like LGBTQ. When in our society, we're pushed to the margins or to the edges of our society, when we're marginalized, when we're pushed into wilderness social locations, those are the what that's a reflection of is not the divine will, but the social and political forces that are at work. And he goes on, while the margin has a primarily negative political connotation as a place of disenfranchisement, Mark ascribes to it a primarily positive theological value. It is the place where the sovereignty of God is made manifest, where the story of liberation is renewed, and where God's intervention in history occurs. I mean, what the story element here is here comes change. John and Jesus, both outside the establishment, on the edges of their society, preaching in the wilderness, traveling and preaching in the wilderness. This is the same universal truth that societal change always comes not from the top, but from the grassroots up, and never from the centers of power, but from the edges and the margins in. It always works from the outside in. And so, what that calls me to do is ask, well, where is God at work on the margins today? In other words, as someone whose social location is often centered in various faith communities that I belong to, you often hear speeches like, how can we include those who are being marginalized? And this is a kind of it's a subtle reversal of that, saying God's actually not at the center where you're needing to invite them to. God's actually on the margins with them already, showing up and doing something special. You need to forget about include, and I understand what I mean by this. Inclusion is important, but be less impassioned about including them in where you're at, and you need to recognize where God's already at work, where they're at. Maybe it's not your table you need to be inviting them to. Maybe it's their table that you need to be learning from. You know what I mean? God's already at work out there.
Yeah, and that's such a crucial point. That when churches finally get around to integrating their leadership to be more racially diverse and intentionally, that's not
It's like the last
opening the
step.
doors for it's not opening the doors for God for the marginalized to finally experience God. It is the church finally kind
Catching
of
up.
allowing God
Yeah.
back into the church, because
Right.
now they're welcoming marginalized people. And the same thing, the government's reaction is not giving people while it is giving people access to the full blessings of the American government, the fact is the more ideal Americanism is at the margins, where people are congregating who are being unjustly treated by the main system. You're finding liberation and finding
Justice.
equality on the
Yes.
margins. And so it's the institutions that slowly play catch up to meeting the ideals that they actually espouse.
Right. Right. I'm thinking of a faith tradition right now that still, even today, struggles to ordain women
Mm-hmm.
as equally as they ordain men. You'll find it in some pockets in some regions, but it's very few. As a official policy, they don't ordain women ministers. Well, God is already at work through those women that are
That's
doing
right.
ministry. And by the time that institution comes around to ordaining women, dude, you've missed. You've missed. I mean, I'm thankful for that happens. I'm not downplaying that happens. What I'm saying is, in the chronology of events, that's like the last thing to happen. God has
Right.
been at work already in all of those marginalized communities up until that point. By the time the church includes the LGBTQ community and affirms
Mm-hmm.
them, dude, it's that's a good thing. But in the chronology of events, again, it's catch up. I mean, God's already been there working in those communities, and now the church is going to recognize that you're not yeah, it's just God shows up first on the margins, on the
Yep.
edges, in the wilderness. And that's what we see in the Jesus story, especially this week with John preaching in the wilderness.
It's the wild, crazy people who are actually working in harmony with God. It's
Right.
the 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 powered, the privileged, the ones who got their act together, the ones cool, calm, collected. Uh, they're not.
Right.
They're too. They're too cool. They're too comfortable. They're too privileged to recognize they have been completely insulated and have insulated themselves from what God is doing.
That's right.
The moment that you have everything that you need and you are functioning the way you want it to is the moment when you've actually lost track of where God is. And that's I had friends talking this week. Couple my friends of color were talking about the arrival of Christopher Columbus to the United States, and they said that was the beginning of very bad things. And I chimed up and said, "Not for me," which they laughed at. But it's true. Is I have been the beneficiary
Right.
of
Of that
colonialization,
extraction.
and I have lived a very comfortable life because of Christopher Columbus. And and my friends and colleagues sitting right next to me, their family's history and their own personal story is significantly different, but God was working in their families' lives. God was with them much more than he was with my families and with me, because they were the ones who were coming from the outside, begging, pleading, working, organizing, strategizing, protesting to get things right. And
Yeah.
we're still in that work. And but that's where God has been. God has been with the indigenous. God has been with the slave. God has been with those on the margins. And that's where all the energy, all the work of God is happening.
Yeah. It's James H. Cone's, big theme. God is the God of the oppressed. And we can add to that we are only really with God when we're standing in solidarity with the oppressed and working alongside the oppressed. And that's not charity. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
indigenous, and I'm going to heavy paraphrase the indigenous quotation from Aboriginal, quotation from Australia that, if you're here to help me, liberate me, just go home. But if
Mm-hmm.
somehow you're reclaiming the reclamation of your humanity is bound up with the liberation of mine, then you're welcome to stay. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And so we realize that even though we may have materially benefited, there is untold damage done to our souls through the
Sure.
privilege. And part of what God is doing is not just liberating the oppressed, but if they would choose to do it, it's also an opportunity for the oppressor to reclaim
That's
their
right.
own humanity, to be part of that. In other words, at the center, there's too often talk of inclusion to the exploitative system. What I mean by that is let's give equal opportunity for a system that still creates winners and
Right.
losers and let them at
Right.
our exploitative, extractive, unjust table. You know what I mean? Let's be inclusive. Inclusion is important, but the reality is that table needs flipped, not
That's right.
invited people to sit at. We need to realize we need to learn from what God is already doing at the tables on the edges.
Right. And that's exactly right. There's we the system that caused this inequality, the system that caused this injustice must itself be reformed at a minimum, if not destroyed,
Mhm.
to rectify how things are done, or else it will just continue. The system will perpetuate itself by continuing to exploit somebody somewhere,
Yeah,
and
yeah. That's you
and
sound
we'll,
like
even if we
Peter.
started treating everybody in our own country as equals, which we're not doing, but even if we got to that point, we'd find a way to mistreat people in other parts of the globe, which we are
Sure.
doing as well.
Right. You sound like Peter Gomes to me in his book, The Scandalous Gospel or Jesus, Scandalous Gospel of Jesus. Maybe that's the title. Maybe it's not. Peter Gomes is scandalous. Those are the two words I remember. But he was saying that, the gospel message that the last shall be first and the first shall be last is good news if you're last, right?
Right.
It's at least problematic if you see yourself as first. And then he
That's
goes
right.
on to say exactly what you just said, that the status quo is not to be critiqued. It is to be destroyed. And that's heavy. No wonder John ended up being beheaded by Herod. You know what I mean?
That's right.
This stuff is
Yep.
it's more than just handing out tickets so people can go to the post-mortem non-smoking section. You know what I mean? This is this is this is stuff that challenges people's privilege and power and wealth here and now.
And I think it's interesting. I think, and you point this out in your writing this week, the prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. That that message of this is bringing, setting things up so God can come and reign,
Mm-hmm.
and making sure that God can get to wherever God is going and be able to establish a reign in the world. And I think, and you look at those people in history who have been leaders of liberation and justice, and they're that's exactly the work they do, is they are preparing the way for the Lord, and and opening pathways and getting access to this, to changing the system
That's
and
right.
allowing God to work. And it's very powerful.
Yeah, I think of MLK. I think of scholars like James Cone. I think of Oscar Romero. I even think of people like Cleve Jones. All of these people did the work of preparing the way of the Lord, to establish the world in justice. And this reign of God, it's really important that we hear that language, not the way the Christian right has defined it, but that
Mm-hmm.
we understand it in its original context as being the opposite or opposed to, by contrast to, the empire of Rome and the way that
That's right.
Rome did things. What does the world look like if it was run according to the God of the Torah, like debt forgiveness and resource sharing and taking care of one another and the golden rule? Those type. It doesn't mean becoming religiously conservative. It means taking care of your neighbor.
That's right.
That's what the reign of God means.
And the reign of God also means a system of governance, a system of economics, a system of egalitarianism and equity for all that does not exist currently. It is not,
Yeah, exactly.
that does not exist. We are talking about still working towards something that does not exist. We don't just need to reach the ideals of Americanism, or we don't need to meet the ideals of certainly a specific religious faith's version of Americanism. It's we're talking about a fundamentally different way of living in the world
Mm-hmm.
that is not seen today and must still be created and constructed.
Yeah, Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas uses the phrase of union. She uses the phrase God's just future. Rather than talking about the kingdom of God or the reign of God, all these biblical terms, she just calls it God's just future. Whatever justice
Mm-hmm.
looks like,
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're talking about. Distributive justice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this week is good. I mean, I don't know what the Advent theme is, but when saw all this stuff on social location of John supposed to be part of the temple establishment, but turning his back on that and going out and preaching like a Hebrew prophet of justice in the wilderness, I thought, man, there's something dynamite right there in that narrative. So who knows what Advent's supposed to be about this week?
We don't. I think peace or love would or joy would all fit somehow with what we talked about tonight. So
that's right.
I think we're
peace, because if you want peace, work for justice, and that's what John was calling for.
And if you're looking for joy, you'll find it when you join those on the margins.
That's right. That's right.
Fellowship with them. And love, justice is the work of love. So
right. It's all good. It's all
good.
It's all Advent. It's all
we got it covered. Got it covered. So light your candle and be confident.
Light your candle and go in peace.
That's right. You got anything else, man?
No, man. That's what I got this week. I just got, again, tunnel vision, just carried away with this wilderness theme.
That's good. Well, next year something else will catch your eye, and we'll talk about that.
Sure, I'm sure. All right, Todd. If you want to find out more, go to renewedheartministries.com. You can find me there. You can eventually find Todd there. Again, if you appreciate this show, hit like, subscribe, all that stuff. Leave us a comment. Also, if you'd like to support our work, you can go to Renewed Heart Ministries and click donate. We're at the end of the year, and all donations right now are being matched. You can make a special donation, receive a thank you gift, or you can become one of our monthly sustaining partners and receive an additional thank you gift here at the end of the year. But whatever you do, all support right now is being matched dollar for dollar, so you can make your support go twice as far. And if you like this show, again, share with your friends, tell others about it.
All right. Well, happy Advent, everyone. We wish you all the best, and we will look forward to seeing you next week.
All right. See you next week, everyone.